January 17, 1945. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The snow falls silent and heavy over the fractured pines. No wind, no birdsong, only the muffled crunch of boots on frost and the distant rumble of artillery that has become the heartbeat of this broken land. In a makeshift field hospital erected inside what remains of a stone farmhouse, a German nurse named Greta Hoffmann kneels beside a soldier whose leg has been amputated above the knee. Her hands are cracked from cold. Her fingers, stiff and clumsy, fumble with bandages made from torn bed sheets. The morphine ran out 3 days ago. The surgical thread, 2 weeks before that. She whispers something to him, something soft, something maternal. But her stomach growls louder than her voice. She has not eaten in 48 hours. Outside, the war continues its slow, relentless consumption of Europe. This is not the war that was promised. When the Wehrmacht surged across the Polish frontier in September 1939, the German soldiers carried with them more than rifles and tanks. They carried belief in the Führer's vision of a new Europe, a 1,000-year Reich built on the bones of the old order. The propaganda films showed gleaming columns of men marching in perfect synchronization, their boots striking cobblestone streets in rhythmic declaration of power. The newsreels promised swift victory, fertile lands to the east, and the restoration of German pride after the humiliation of Versailles. The nurses who followed the Wehrmacht into occupied territories, women like Greta Hoffmann, believed they were part of something noble, something necessary. They were told they would bring order to chaos, German efficiency to Slavic disorder, medical care to the wounded soldiers of a superior civilization. But ideology, no matter how fervently believed, cannot be eaten. And by the winter of 1945, the Reich was starving. The collapse began not with a single battle, but with the slow erosion of supply lines, the methodical destruction of infrastructure, the relentless pressure applied by forces on every front. The Eastern Front had consumed entire armies. Stalingrad had devoured the Sixth Army whole, swallowing 280,000 men into the frozen wasteland and spitting back fewer than 6,000. The Allied bombing campaign had turned German cities into moonscapes of rubble and ash. Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, once proud centers of culture and industry, reduced to skeletal ruins where survivors picked through debris searching for the dead. And in the occupied territories, where German field hospitals struggled to care for the mounting tide of wounded, the supplies dwindled to nothing. By January 1945, the medical corps attached to Army Group B in the Ardennes operated under conditions that would have been unthinkable 3 years prior. Bandages were washed and reused until they disintegrated. Surgical instruments were sterilized over open flames when fuel allowed, left unsterilized when it did not. Anesthesia was a luxury reserved for the most critical surgeries, and even then, it was administered in doses too small to fully numb the pain. The wounded screamed. They always screamed. And the nurses, many of them barely out of their 20s, worked through exhaustion that had long since passed into a kind of waking trance. They moved through the wards like ghosts, their eyes sunken, their bodies skeletal beneath threadbare uniforms. Greta Hoffmann had joined the German Red Cross in 1941, when victory still seemed inevitable. She had been trained at a hospital in Munich, where the instructors spoke of duty and sacrifice, of the noble calling to serve the soldiers of the Reich. She had believed every word. She had sewn the Red Cross onto her uniform with pride, had kissed her mother goodbye at the train station, had traveled east with a cohort of young women who sang patriotic songs as the landscape rolled past their windows. They were going to be part of history. They were going to help build the new Europe. But history, Greta learned, is written in blood and hunger. The food rations for medical personnel were supposed to be supplemented by local supplies, requisitioned from the occupied populations. But by 1945, there was nothing left to requisition. The civilians were starving, the soldiers were starving, and the nurses, tasked with keeping men alive long enough to be patched up and sent back to die at the front, found themselves growing weaker by the day. Greta's daily ration consisted of a slice of black bread so dense and bitter it could hardly be chewed, a thin soup made from potato peels and water, and occasionally a cube of margarine that tasted of chemicals and despair. She had lost 30 pounds since the beginning of the war. Her periods had stopped. Her hair, once thick and blonde, had begun to thin and fall out in clumps. And yet she worked. Because what else was there to do? The American advance into Belgium in the winter of 1945 was methodical and overwhelming. The Wehrmacht, battered by the failed Ardennes offensive, the desperate gamble that history would remember as the Battle of the Bulge, fell back in disarray. The field hospitals, too slow to evacuate and too valuable to abandon, were overrun. On the morning of January 17th, elements of the U.S. Third Army entered the village of Houffalize and discovered the German medical station hidden in the stone farmhouse at the edge of the forest. Greta. Hoffman heard the American voices before she saw the soldiers. The accent was unmistakable, sharp, confident, foreign. She felt her heart seize in her chest. She had been told stories about the Americans. The propaganda had painted them as ruthless gangsters, criminals in uniform who would show no mercy to captured Germans. She had heard whispers of atrocities, of nurses shot, of hospitals burned. She did not know what to believe. But as the voices grew louder, she stood from where she knelt beside the wounded soldier and straightened her uniform as best she could. If she was going to die, she would die with dignity. The door opened. Cold air rushed in, carrying with it the smell of diesel and wet wool. The American soldiers who entered were enormous. That was Greta's first thought. They were so much larger than the German soldiers she had grown accustomed to, taller, broader, their uniforms clean and intact, their faces ruddy with health. They carried rifles, but they did not point them at her. They simply stood in the doorway, surveying the scene with expressions that shifted from suspicion to something else. Something Greta could not immediately identify. Pity. The officer in charge, a captain named William Hargrove, stepped forward. He spoke no German, and Greta spoke no English, but one of the soldiers behind him, a private named Otto Fischer, a second-generation German-American from Pennsylvania, translated. The captain's voice was firm but not cruel. He told Greta that the hospital was now under American control. The wounded would be evacuated and treated. The medical personnel would be taken as prisoners of war. Greta nodded. She understood. She expected nothing more. But then the captain did something she did not expect. He gestured to the soldiers behind him, and they began to unload supplies from the trucks parked outside. Crates of bandages, still wrapped in sterile packaging. Boxes of sulfa powder and morphine ampules. Clean surgical instruments. And food. So much food. Greta Hoffman watched in stunned silence as the American soldiers carried in crates of K-rations, cans of Spam and corned beef, bars of chocolate wrapped in waxed paper, tins of powdered milk and coffee. They stacked the supplies in the corner of the room, and then the captain said something else. Private Fisher translated, "The captain says you and your staff should eat. You look like you need it." Greta did not move. She could not. She stared at the crates of food as though they were a mirage, something her starving mind had conjured from desperation. But the smell was real. The rich, fatty smell of canned meat. The sweet, almost narcotic aroma of chocolate. Her stomach cramped with sudden, vicious hunger. One of the American medics, a woman, stepped forward. Her name was Lieutenant Sarah Brennan, and she was attached to the 45th Field Hospital. She was the first American woman Greta had seen, and the contrast was overwhelming. Lieutenant Brennan was healthy, her cheeks full, her eyes bright, her uniform crisp and clean. She carried herself with an ease that Greta had not felt in years. She knelt beside Greta and opened one of the K-ration boxes. She pulled out a tin of crackers, a small brick of cheese, a bar of chocolate. She held them out. Greta looked at the food, then at the American woman, then back at the food. And then, for the first time in 3 years, Greta Hoffmann began to cry. She cried not from relief, though relief was part of it. She cried not from exhaustion, though exhaustion had hollowed her out long ago. She cried because the gesture, the simple human act of one woman offering food to another, shattered something inside her, some carefully constructed wall that had kept her moving through the horror of the past years. She had been taught to see the Americans as enemies, as the corrupt representatives of a decadent, mongrel civilization. But here was this woman, this enemy, offering her bread and cheese and chocolate without hesitation, without cruelty, without the gloating superiority of a conqueror. Lieutenant Brennan did not speak German, but she did not need to. She pressed the food into Greta's hands and squeezed her shoulder. And Greta, who had held dying men in her arms and washed blood from her hands in freezing water and worked until her body was little more than bone and will, broke down completely. The other German nurses, watching from across the room, began to cry as well. The American soldiers did not understand what they were witnessing. To them, it was a simple act of decency. The Geneva Conventions required the humane treatment of medical personnel, and besides, they had food to spare. The logistics network that supplied the American forces in Europe was a marvel of industrial efficiency. Every day, tens of thousands of tons of supplies flowed from American factories across the Atlantic, through the port of Antwerp, and up to the front lines. The soldiers ate well: canned meat, fresh bread when available, coffee, chocolate, cigarettes. They complained about the monotony of K-rations, but they never went hungry. The abundance was so routine, so expected, that they scarcely thought about it. But to the German nurses, the abundance was incomprehensible. It was as though the Americans existed in a different reality, a world where scarcity was a distant memory and hunger was something that happened to other people. Greta Hoffmann sat on the floor of the farmhouse, slowly chewing a cracker, and felt the salt and fat dissolve on her tongue. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. She ate slowly, methodically, forcing herself not to devour the entire ration at once. Her stomach, shrunken from months of deprivation, could not handle too much at once. But even that small amount of food, a few crackers, a sliver of cheese, a square of chocolate, sent warmth spreading through her body. She felt her mind begin to clear, the fog of starvation lifting just enough for her to think clearly for the first time in weeks. And with that clarity came a question she could not answer. How? How could the Americans, fighting a war on two fronts, supply their forces so completely? How could they afford to give food to their enemies? How could they produce so much, ship so much, distribute so much, without their own people starving? Greta had been told that America was a land of excess and waste, a place where capitalism had created vast inequalities and left millions in poverty. She had been told that American soldiers were poorly trained conscripts, that their equipment was inferior, that their will to fight was weak. She had been told many things, and all of them, she now understood, had been lies. The reality was written in the crates of food stacked in the corner, in the clean bandages and morphine ampules, in the healthy faces of the American soldiers. The reality was that the Reich, for all its talk of superiority and destiny, had been defeated not by ideology, but by industry, by factories that could outproduce German factories 10-1, by farms that could feed an army and a nation and still have surplus to spare, by a system that, for all its flaws, could mobilize resources on a scale that the Third Reich, even at the height of its power, could never match. Lieutenant Brennan stayed with the German nurses for the next several hours, helping them tend to the wounded soldiers. She worked alongside Greta, changing bandages, administering morphine, offering water to men who were too weak to lift their heads. She did not speak much. The language barrier made conversation difficult, but her actions spoke clearly enough. She treated the German wounded with the same care and professionalism she would have given to American soldiers. She did not gloat. She did not lecture. She simply did her job. At one point, Greta attempted to thank her. She used the few English words she knew, her pronunciation clumsy and uncertain. "Thank you. Thank you." Lieutenant Brennan smiled and nodded, but there was something in her expression, a sadness, perhaps, or a weariness, that suggested she understood more than just the words. She understood what it meant for Greta to accept help from the enemy. She understood the cost of that acceptance. As the day wore on, more American medical personnel arrived. They set up a proper evacuation system, triaging the wounded and preparing them for transport to rear-area hospitals. The German nurses were allowed to continue working under American supervision. No one was mistreated. No one was denied food or water. Captain Hargrove made it clear that the medical personnel would be processed as prisoners of war and held in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. Greta listened to the translation and felt a strange sense of disbelief. She had expected punishment. She had expected retribution. But instead, she found only efficiency and pragmatism. By nightfall, the wounded had been evacuated, and the German nurses were loaded onto trucks for transport to a prisoner-of-war camp near Liège. Before she climbed into the truck, Greta turned to look back at the farmhouse. Lieutenant Brennan stood in the doorway, watching her. Their eyes met for a moment, and Greta raised her hand in a small, hesitant wave. Lieutenant Brennan waved back. The truck rumbled through the darkness, following the convoy of American vehicles west. Greta sat in silence, surrounded by the other nurses. No one spoke. They were exhausted, traumatized, uncertain of what came next. But Greta's mind was racing. She thought about the food, the bandages, the morphine. She thought about Lieutenant Brennan's calm professionalism, the way she had treated the German wounded as human beings rather than enemies. She thought about the abundance, the overwhelming, undeniable abundance that the Americans seemed to carry with them like an aura. And she thought about the lies, the propaganda that had told her the Americans were weak, that the Reich was invincible, that victory was inevitable. She had believed those lies because she had wanted to believe them, because belief was easier than doubt. But the evidence of her own eyes had shattered that belief. The Americans were not weak. The Reich was not invincible. And the war, she now understood, had been lost long before the first American soldier set foot in Belgium. The prisoner-of-war camp at Liège was a sprawling complex of tents and prefabricated buildings surrounded by barbed wire. The conditions were basic but adequate. The prisoners received regular meals, never luxurious, but always sufficient. There was medical care for the sick and wounded. There were letters from home, or at least the promise of letters once the postal system was restored. And there was time to think, time to remember, time to process what had happened. Greta Hoffmann spent her days working in the camp hospital, tending to other prisoners. The work was familiar, comforting in its routine. But at night, lying on her cot in the barracks, she found herself replaying that moment in the farmhouse. The moment Lieutenant Brennan had offered her food. The moment she had begun to cry. The moment the wall inside her had crumbled. She wrote about it in a letter to her mother, though she did not know if the letter would ever be delivered. She tried to explain what she had felt, but the words seemed inadequate. How could she describe the shame of realizing she had been deceived? How could she convey the strange, conflicted gratitude she felt toward the Americans who had treated her with more humanity than her own government had shown its people? She wrote and rewrote the letter, searching for the right words, but in the end, she simply folded it and placed it under her pillow. Perhaps one day she would send it. Perhaps not. The symbolic weight of that single K-ration box haunted her. It was such a small thing. A few crackers, a bit of cheese, a bar of chocolate. But it represented something larger. It represented a system that could produce more than it consumed. A society that valued life enough to feed its enemies. A philosophy that saw abundance not as a zero-sum game, but as something that could be shared. The Reich had promised strength through conquest, prosperity through domination. But the Americans had achieved strength through production, prosperity through cooperation. And in the end, that difference had been decisive. Historians would later document the scale of American industrial output during World War II. With numbers so staggering they seemed almost fictional. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories produced nearly 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2 million trucks, and countless tons of ammunition, fuel, and supplies. American shipyards launched a new vessel every single day. American farms fed not only the U.S. military, but also the British, Soviet, and Free French forces. The Lend-Lease program alone delivered over $50 billion worth of equipment and supplies to Allied nations, an amount that dwarfed the entire pre-war German economy. But statistics, no matter how impressive, cannot capture the human reality of that abundance. For Greta Hoffmann, the reality was a bar of chocolate pressed into her hand by a woman who had every reason to hate her. For the thousands of other German prisoners who encountered American generosity in the final months of the war, the reality was the slow, dawning realization that everything they had been told about the enemy was wrong. This realization did not come easily. Ideology, once internalized, resists contradiction. Many prisoners clung to their beliefs, insisting that the American abundance was temporary, that the Reich would rise again, that the Führer's vision was still achievable. But others, like Greta, found their certainty eroded by the undeniable evidence of their own experiences. They had been told that Germans were superior, but they had been defeated. They had been told that the enemy was weak, but the enemy had fed them when their own government could not. They had been told that the war was righteous, but righteousness had not prevented starvation. The psychological transformation that occurred in the prisoner of war camps was subtle but profound. It was not a sudden conversion, not a dramatic renunciation of past beliefs. It was a slow, quiet process of doubt and questioning. It was the German soldier who noticed that the American guards treated prisoners with a casualness that suggested they saw them as human beings rather than monsters. It was the German nurse who realized that the Red Cross parcels arrived with clockwork regularity, that the Americans had systems and logistics and an infrastructure that worked. It was the accumulation of small kindnesses and small mercies that slowly dismantled the edifice of propaganda. By the time the war ended in May 1945, Greta Hoffmann had spent 4 months in Allied custody. She had gained back the weight she had lost. Her hair had begun to grow again. Her strength had returned. But something else had changed as well. Something less tangible but no less real. She no longer believed in the Reich. She no longer believed in the Führer. She no longer believed that the war had been necessary or just or inevitable. She believed, instead, that she had been used, that she and millions of others had been fed lies and sent to die, or to watch others die, all in service of a vision that had been rotten from the start. When she was finally released and allowed to return to Germany in the autumn of 1945, she found a country that no longer existed. The cities were ruins. The government was dissolved. The population was displaced, traumatized, struggling to survive. The abundance she had witnessed in the American camps seemed like a dream, a memory from another world. But it had been real. She knew it had been real because she could still taste the chocolate, still feel the weight of that K-ration box in her hands. She never saw Lieutenant Sarah Brennan again. She did not know what had become of her, whether she had returned home to America or remained in Europe as part of the occupation forces. But she thought about her often. She thought about the way Lieutenant Brennan had knelt beside her without hesitation, had offered food without condescension, had treated her as a fellow human being rather than a defeated enemy. And she wondered if Lieutenant Brennan understood the magnitude of what she had done. Not just the act of sharing rations, but the act of showing Greta that another way of living was possible. The food had been a symbol, yes, but it had also been a message. A message that said, the world does not have to be built on conquest and scarcity. It can be built on production and plenty. It can be built on the principle that there is enough for everyone if only we choose to share. That message, delivered in a single moment of kindness on a cold January day, changed Greta Hoffmann's life. It did not erase the trauma of the war, did not absolve her of her complicity in the Reich's crimes, did not make the past any less painful, but it gave her something to believe in again. Not an ideology, not a leader, not a vision of dominance, just the simple, radical idea that humanity could do better. In the decades that followed, Greta Hoffmann would tell her story to her children and grandchildren. She would describe the moment Lieutenant Brennan had offered her food, the moment she had begun to cry. She would explain how that moment had broken something inside her, and in breaking it, had allowed something new to grow. She would speak of the abundance she had witnessed, the industrial might that had seemed like magic, but was merely the product of a free society working toward a common goal. And she would insist, always, that the lesson of that moment was not about American superiority or German inferiority. It was about the power of systems and choices, the choice to build rather than destroy, the choice to share rather than hoard, the choice to see the enemy as human. Her grandchildren, growing up in a rebuilt Germany, a prosperous Germany, a democratic Germany, would listen to her stories with the polite attention of young people who could not fully grasp the world their grandmother described. They had never known hunger. They had never lived under dictatorship. They had never experienced the collapse of everything they believed in. But they understood, at least intellectually, that the world they inherited had been built on the ruins of the world their grandmother had known. And they understood that the choices made in the aftermath of that collapse, the choice to rebuild rather than punish, to integrate rather than isolate, to invest rather than abandon, had made their lives possible. The Marshall Plan, announced in 1947, would pour billions of dollars into the reconstruction of Europe. American food, American machinery, American expertise would help rebuild the shattered economies of friend and foe alike. The policy was driven by pragmatism as much as altruism, by the recognition that a prosperous Europe was essential to American security and prosperity. But it was also driven by the same principle that had guided Lieutenant Brennan when she offered Greta Hoffmann a K-ration box, the recognition that abundance shared is abundance multiplied, and that the alternative, a Europe left to fester in poverty and resentment, would inevitably lead to another war. Greta Hoffmann lived to see the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the reunification of Germany, the integration of Europe. She lived to see her grandchildren grow up in a world where war between European nations seemed unthinkable, where borders were open, where cooperation was the norm rather than the exception. She lived long enough to reflect on the arc of her own life, from the idealistic young nurse who had believed in the Reich to the elderly woman who had spent decades advocating for peace and reconciliation. And she never forgot the moment that had changed everything. The moment an American woman had knelt beside her and offered her food. The moment she had realized that the enemy was not the monster she had been told to fear, but a human being capable of kindness. That moment, multiplied by thousands of similar moments across the wreckage of Europe, became the foundation of a new order. Not a perfect order. There would be injustices, mistakes, failures, but an order built on the principle that the solution to scarcity is production, that the solution to hatred is understanding, and that the solution to war is the patient, difficult work of building a world where everyone has enough. The chocolate bar, the crackers, the cheese, they were not just food. They were proof that another way was possible, proof that abundance could be shared, proof that the ideology of conquest and domination was not just morally bankrupt, but practically obsolete. The future did not belong to those who hoarded and starved and conquered. It belonged to those who produced and shared and built. And so, in a cold farmhouse in the Ardennes, in the middle of a war that had already killed tens of millions, a small act of kindness planted a seed that would grow into a new Europe, a new relationship between former enemies, a new understanding of what it meant to be human. Greta Hoffmann carried that seed with her for the rest of her life. She nurtured it with her stories, her advocacy, her refusal to forget. And when she died, at the age of 87, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had never known hunger or tyranny, the seed she had carried had grown into a forest, a living testament to the power of abundance, the necessity of compassion, and the enduring truth that even in the darkest moments, a single act of humanity can change the world. The tears Greta Hoffmann shed on that January day were not just tears of relief or gratitude. They were tears of recognition. Recognition that the war was over, not because the battles had ended, but because the ideology that had sustained it had been revealed as hollow. Recognition that the promise of the Reich, strength through domination, prosperity through conquest, had been a lie, and that the truth lay in the hands of a woman who had enough to share. Recognition that the future, if there was to be a future, would have to be built on different principles. Principles not of scarcity, but of abundance. Not of hatred, but of kinship. Not of walls, but of bridges. The American soldiers who offered food to starving German nurses in the winter of 1945 could not have known the long-term consequences of their actions. They were simply following orders, doing their jobs, behaving with the decency that came naturally to them. But their actions, and thousands of others like them, set in motion a transformation that would reshape the post-war world. They demonstrated in the most visceral way possible that democracy and capitalism, for all their flaws, could produce a level of material prosperity that made the promises of fascism look pathetic by comparison. They showed that a society built on individual freedom and open markets could mobilize resources more effectively than any totalitarian state. And they proved that the true measure of a civilization is not its capacity for destruction, but its willingness to share its abundance even with those who had sought its annihilation. That lesson, learned in the ruins of Germany and the frozen forests of Belgium, echoes through the decades. It reminds us that the alternative to war is not simply the absence of conflict, but the presence of justice and prosperity. It reminds us that the tools we use to defeat our enemies, military might, industrial production, technological innovation, are less important than the values that guide their use. And it reminds us that in the end, the most powerful weapon is not the bomb or the bullet, but the simple, revolutionary act of recognizing the humanity of the other. Greta Hoffmann's tears were the tears of a woman who had glimpsed, for the first time, a world beyond the one she had known, a world where enough was not a distant dream, but a daily reality, a world where the enemy could become a friend, where the vanquished could be fed rather than destroyed, where the future was not a repetition of the past, but a departure from it. She cried because she understood, in that moment, that the war had not just been lost on the battlefield. It had been lost in the hospitals and factories, in the farms and shipyards, in the vast, humming machinery of a democratic society at full mobilization, and she cried because, despite everything, she was grateful. Grateful to be alive, grateful to be fed, grateful to have been shown, at the darkest moment of her life, that the world was larger and more generous than she had been taught to believe. That gratitude would sustain her through the difficult years of Reconstruction, through the reckoning with her own complicity, through the slow, painful process of rebuilding a life in a country that no longer existed, and it would sustain her descendants, who would inherit not just the scars of the past, but the possibility of a better future. The farmhouse in the Ardennes is gone now, torn down long ago. The war has passed into memory, and memory has passed into history. But the lesson remains. The lesson that abundance is not won through conquest, but through cooperation. That prosperity is not achieved by taking from others, but by building together. That the true victory is not in the destruction of the enemy, but in the transformation of enemies into friends. And that sometimes, in the midst of the most terrible suffering, a single act of kindness, a K-ration box offered with compassion, can crack open the future and let the light pour in.